Hello everyone, and welcome to Duke It Out. Today, we have yet another sequel in the Metatron saga. If this is your first time watching me or hearing of this Metatron saga, well, hello! My name is Terry Duke, I have a main gaming channel here on YouTube, but this channel is a side project where, full disclosure, I share my opinions as a leftist. And a big part of this side project over the past year has been about analyzing the content of one particular YouTuber, Metatron. Back when I was into historical sword fighting years ago, Metatron was one of the many YouTubers I enjoyed watching, but over time, he started making more right-leaning content, and a lot of his videos became largely incorrect at best and downright dishonest at worst. And for all his claims of being non-political or being welcoming of all sides of the political spectrum, the truth is that Metatron's content is quite often political and predominantly appeals to the right wing. Not, mind you, because he's a neutral academic who only cares about the facts, but because he spends a lot of time criticizing historical shows and movies for having diversity in them. He also spends a lot of time dunking on what I can only call random SJW articles from the weirdest corners of the internet that, let's face it, nobody would actually know about until he brings them up to the surface. He also spent a lot of time calling these trends of diversity in historical fiction an agenda of political correctness to change how society remembers history. And the thing is, for someone who claims to be neutral, he sure tends to ignore a lot of attacks on history coming from the right under a very thin pretext that doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And the latter is what this video really is about. For the past year, I've been exposing the biases, the lies, and the right-wing grift coming from Metatron, but with a direct response from him, as well as a recent video of his, I think it's something that has become provable with very little doubt. And in that way, it's also the culmination of all my previous videos, so if you haven't seen them, I do recommend you watch them to get the full context of the things I'm talking about, but for this video, I'll be talking about one specific criticism I made and how he responded to it. So to recap, the criticism, that is, of Metatron purposefully not attacking the right, was something I talked about in my second essay on him, where I responded to one of his videos talking about historical revisionism in the modern day. This video was where Metatron compiled his rhetoric on diversity in historical movies and took it even further. It was no longer merely inaccurate to portray historical characters with different ethnicities. The premise of this video was that there is an agenda to systematically attack the historical truth, both in the media and in academia.
We'll also see how real historical facts are being changed in the present, how historical truth is under a systematic extensive attack fueled by corporate money, which is permeating both the educational and edutainment infrastructure, particularly in Western society within the Anglosphere. It's an attack to our collective memory.
But while I spent a good chunk of the video debunking the claims being made, by which I mean Metatron was virtually wrong on everything he brought up, I also wanted to emphasize on the issues that Metatron was deliberately not talking about. You see, if Metatron claims not to be political, but only to fight for the historical truth, and does so from the position that history itself is under systemic attack, then it's really strange that he almost exclusively only fights against diverse castings at private productions, old BBC cartoons, and obscure websites that nobody really knows about. And that's because if we're going to start from the premise that the historical truth is under attack, then these examples are not the real dangers, far from it in fact. Don't get me wrong, while it is absolutely possible for casual viewers to watch something covering a topic they know little about and coming out believing misconceptions, what Metatron always leaves out of the conversation is the fact that movies, shows, and private documentaries are not part of actual academia. Netflix producing a documentary made with an Afrocentrist producer is not going to single-handedly override all the academia and science that went into studying Cleopatra, and it's certainly not affecting curriculums from public education anywhere in the world. In reality, if a society is going to be brainwashed into remembering history differently, it's going to have to come from a central authority with enough power to ensure a narrative is uniformly applied to all members of a community. In that sense, it's not going to come from a decentralized, privatized media industry doing the occasional tokenism. It's going to come from state propaganda, which can take many forms, but in the context of teaching a historical narrative to an entire population, then it's going to come from public education, and the government dictating what is to be taught to all students in that country. And in my previous video, I brought up a couple of examples of this just from the United States, where right-wing politicians have actively been banning books and forcing schools to change their curriculums. From there, I argued that if Metatron genuinely wants to fight for the historical truth, then those are the instances that he should be covering on his channel. And then I went on a bit of a leap where I accused Metatron of not talking about those things on purpose. Not because it's too political, mind you. Metatron can begin every video saying that he's not being political all he wants, but the very premise of fighting for the truth against the perceived adversary that is trying to change history to fit their narrative, That is by design being political. And he's done it multiple times already, just not with the examples that really matter. What I argued was the real reason for him not talking about those instances is because he's a right-wing grifter. It's because he knows he appeals to the right, and he knows that going from attacking woke Netflix to attacking the American right in such a direct manner would not go well with the right-wing viewers that now makes up the bulk of his audience. I said the accusation was a leap because Metatron purposefully not covering these things is not something I could prove at the time. Although, as mentioned in my previous video, a viewer of his had called him out on the hypocrisy and cited several examples, and Metatron had responded saying that those examples were too political and therefore beyond the scope of his channel. However, he still made a video on politics ruining children's education, and instead of bringing up those examples, he chose to still focus on the BBC cartoon from 7 years ago. So it's funny how that works. But anyway, a couple of months later, I made another video on Metatron, this time much shorter, only making fun of a video he made in which he was pretty lazy overall, but I guess it was enough provocations for Metatron to finally respond. And that brings us to the present. As of recording this is my only direct interaction with Metatron. I won't go over the entire comment, but I'll focus instead on the part that addresses what I was just talking about, ignoring historical negationism coming from the right. Once again, Metatron insists he didn't know of those instances, but also argued, again, that it's too political, except for one. The one example being about the new Florida teaching standards that said black people benefited from slavery. To this, Metatron says that he would consider making a video on it due to my suggestion, and lo and behold, here we are. Before we start though, can we talk about the thumbnail? You're talking about American slavery, but the hands and shackles are white. And the ship on the other side isn't even a slave ship, it's just a modern, rusty ship. I don't really know the scale of Metatron's production, but he's releasing videos like every 2 days now. Maybe make it 3 days and do some more quality checks? But I digress. So I pointed out an example of the right trying to change history, Metatron took on the suggestions, so here we are. Before we get into it though, let me bring a bit of context. About a year ago in Florida, the Board of Education released a new history teaching standard for public schools. Teaching standards, according to Project 10, are a set of objectives that describe what students are expected to know and be able to achieve at each grade level. So while these documents are not school textbooks per se, once they're established, teachers are expected, to the best of their capabilities, to transfer the same talking points onto the students. This is pretty standard procedure, however, this particular history teaching standard that was released last year contains some questionable language. Namely, the guide implied that black people benefited from slavery through the skills they learned while enslaved. It also implied in a different section that black people also committed violence during race massacres. Now, these are two small sections from a document of 216 pages, for which nothing else had any significant backlash that I know of. So while it seems small, it's also important to take this document in the context that it was released. For starters, this guide came after a law called the Stop Woke Act was passed by far-right Governor of Florida Ron DeSantis, which essentially forced schools all across the state to ban all kinds of books as well as restricting teachings of anything that's considered woke indoctrination, by which it really means anything in the curriculum that conservatives don't like, including parts of history. In case it wasn't clear, this law effectively censored free speech. But this law also resulted in the administration blocking a new advanced placement course on African American studies just a few months before this new guide was released, which wasn't allowed into schools until it significantly drew back a lot of its content, including the removal of several key black authors. So the point here is that after spending a couple of years fighting against schools and the woke moral panic, these choice of words were reasonably seen as just another step by the right-wing Republican administration to limit what can be taught in Florida schools, as well as trying to find a silver lining in something like slavery. So after years of covering meaningless woke tokenism and avoiding anything else presumably deemed too political, Metatron is finally here, about to talk about an actual example of politicians using the power of the state to enforce a narrative on American history, which I would argue is the real danger to the historical truth. So how is that gonna go? Is Metatron going to hold no punches, tell it like it is, whether this attack on history comes from the right or the left? And will he hold the line against the critics, like on those t-shirts he sells? Or is he, I don't know, going to strip the topic of all its political context, give the right as much benefit of the doubt as he possibly can, somehow find a way to make it about the left, and pretend like it's not political at all?
Hey noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today's topic is kind of a stronger, a little bit heavy topic if you will, because we're going to talk about slavery in history. The inspiration for this topic actually came from a whole situation that occurred in 2023, which is of course has to do with politics. Now, as you know, I don't discuss politics, even less so American politics, since I'm not American, but it seems like that there is a whole situation when you go Google the idea of slavery, particularly in connection with Florida and new standards to teach, that has created backlash.
Okay, so I already said it, but I'll say it again now because he's just being misleading. The inspiration for this video came from me and some of his viewers. He didn't get the idea from reading about it, he wasn't just casually Googling. He heard about it from my videos and told me directly that he might make this video due to my suggestion. As to why he didn't want to bring me up, my guess is he doesn't want to risk sending people my way in case I tell them, for example, how he clearly did not watch The Woman King before making his video on it, or how he was never censored by YouTube but let people believe it so he'd get more financial support on Patreon, or how some of his videos are clearly lazy and full of lies. Although, I suppose another reason could be that he just wants to stay on topic and bringing me up doesn't advance the video. But what do I know? Could be either.
Already by reading the titles, we can get a little bit of a hint as to what this has to do with the teaching curricula in the United States. We read, Florida's new history standard, a blow to our students and nation. New Florida standards teach that black people benefited from slavery. And CBC News says, Florida's new black history curriculum says slaves developed skills that could be used. So of course we can see that this not only has to do specifically with slavery, it has to do with the idea of, okay, but what sort of skills did slaves actually develop in the US specifically, and then it has to do with African American history. Now, I understand that some people will say, well, yeah, but even in history there is politics, and that's absolutely true, but one thing is discussing politics or political science from a historical standpoint, understanding exactly where things land with the aid of documented evidence, and the other thing is to allow propaganda to shape the way we present information specifically to a younger audience. I think the only person that can come to this with a more of an unbiased position is those who sort of set aside the political preferences and say, okay, but in this specific case, we are talking about slavery. It's a precise topic.
Well, that's certainly interesting. We're just not gonna talk about the politics, even though the articles he cited clearly point to the language of the guide and the political implications of such a thing. The whole point of me bringing up this example was that politics are getting into schools and pointing out how dangerous that is and how this should be what he covers on his channel because of it. But if he's going to avoid talking about the politics, then what even is the point? Instead, he wants to talk about it from the perspective of a teacher that ignores all the politics.
What sort of history is being taught in schools is absolutely something that I find a very strong item of interest of mine, not only because I'm a former school teacher and I used to teach, I did that for over a decade, so that's definitely something that I think I can speak not from the perspective of politicians that know absolutely nothing when it comes to how you teach history at school, but from the perspective of someone who has spent over a decade doing the very thing.
But that's the thing though, the curriculum is being influenced by politicians, not the teachers. So if Metatron wants to talk about it from the perspective of a teacher, it starts with putting politicians back in their place, and calling out their actions when it gets in the way of teaching, which is exactly what some people quoted in the articles he cited are doing. Here's a quote from the president of the Florida Education Association. How can our students ever be equipped for the future if they don't have a full honest picture of where we've come from? Florida students deserve a world-class education that equips them to be successful adults who can help heal our nation's divisions rather than deepen them. Governor DeSantis is pursuing a political agenda guaranteed to set good people against one another, and in the process, he's cheating our kids. They deserve the full truth of American history, the good and the bad. That is quite literally what Metatron should be saying of this entire issue, if he was consistent, that is, and honest.
And when it comes to propaganda, unfortunately, no side of the political spectrum is safe from it. Because in this case, the accusation is that the right wing, or the American right, is trying to push a propagandized message to the students, trying to teach things that, according to Harris as a speaker, is incorrect. But then again, propaganda is pushed also from far left-wing positions too.
This is such a dishonest framing. Yes, the accusation is that the right is trying to push propaganda, and Metatron knows this. He read the articles. The fact that he can't even present it properly should be the first sign of a grift. Oh, I guess the accusation is that the right is doing propaganda, but what about the left? They also do propaganda, so like, the right gets accused here, but like, the left too, so... My god, what a weasel.
But in this specific case, we are talking about slavery. It's a precise topic. Did slaves actually earn skills? And that is really the question we should ask.
And that's about it. From here on out, Metatron is just switching the topic completely. The premise isn't whether or not slaves earned skills, it's whether they benefited from slavery by being forced to learn certain skills. This is what the entire conversation is about. And again, by purposefully reframing the question, Metatron is trying to make it out as if the topic is neutral, purely academic, and if anyone is being critical, then surely it comes from the left. That said, Metatron has delved pretty deep into the topic, at least according to him.
Now, one of the things that I try to do in order to try and come prepared to this discussion is that I actually looked at this bill that oftentimes is referred or mentioned during these articles that talk about this situation, and I read the entire thing. But really what I did understand from both reading what these politicians said and what the bill actually says and how this Board of Education has prepared the information, I think everything really boils down onto how a teacher will present the information that has been prepared by the board.
I just want to say, the teachers do have a pretty good understanding of what the guide implies with its wording. One of them explains it in one of the very articles that Metatron quickly shows at the beginning, but by framing the guide and how it impacts teaching by leaving it up to how teachers use the information, Metatron is getting rid of having to talk about the guide completely, instead talking about hypothetical, individual teachers and what those might say. Also, he never presents the guide in question, or even cites it, but I'll just say, it's over 200 pages long, so I genuinely doubt that Metatron read the whole thing.
What I say by that is the following. If you take the statement, slaves learned skills by being slaves, then the answer to that is absolutely yes. With that being said, it is also important to underline that the slavery is indeed something that we as a society condemn, and of course the simple fact that a slave may have learned skills due to the fact that he was performing work or labor, even though he wasn't paid for it, doesn't justify nor makes it beneficial to have become a slave. Should we deny the fact that these people became really good at doing these things and absolutely learned a skill? No, I don't think we should deny it. But what we should do is to contextualize it correctly.
And this is the only credit I can give Metatron. He does not believe slaves learning skills should be seen as a benefit of slavery, let alone a benefit to the slaves. Amazing. The problem though is that he could not even say this without making up a strawman. No one is suggesting that we should outright deny the fact that slaves learned skills. It's certainly not a point made by anyone anywhere I looked. That's not what the conversation is. It's about whether slaves benefited from slavery by learning skills. Metatron can disagree with the premise all he wants, but if he's purposefully ignoring the political implications, then what even is the point of this video? We're already halfway through, and by dumbing down the topic, Metatron is not adding anything of value. He's just going off for a while about how slaves throughout history would have learned skills based on what they did, and arguing that it should not be controversial to state that fact. Which it isn't, because it's not what people are talking about. But he does somehow bring it back on track just for a moment.
Which is why my position is the simple fact that you had a Greek slave in ancient Rome, and let's say that they were very educated, and then they were often forced to teach the kids of the wealthy Roman families. They learned skills and become excellent teachers as a result. Absolutely, I'm not going to hide that, and saying that is not racist, unless what you're trying to present is that, oh, therefore being a slave wasn't so bad, and in fact, you see, if you weren't a slave, you wouldn't have learned that. If that's what's being presented, that's nonsense. The experience of a slave is dehumanizing and it's horrible, and I agree with that statement.
Well, you heard it, everyone. If the guide says what it says, and if a hypothetical teacher uses the information to downplay slavery, then that's bad. But is that what the guide effectively enforces on all teachers? Well, we can't confirm or deny that because we're not talking about politics on this channel, see? But hey, if an individual teacher says that of their own volition, well, in that specific case, Metatron opposes it. Well, that's nice, I guess.
But what I disagree with is that doesn't mean that now, just because slavery is horrible, we need to hide facts. They absolutely learned those skills. And I'm not gonna hide that and say, oh no, they didn't. No, they didn't because slavery is horrible. That's quite pathetic in my opinion.
Well, again, nobody is saying that. It's just a straw man to make it about the left. Which, to be clear, Kamala Harris is not a leftist, okay? But even she did not argue that you can't talk about slaves learning skills. She's against the phrasing like everyone else.
And the way we should look at this from an educational standpoint is, how are the teachers teaching this? Are the teachers trying to justify slavery and say, oh, you know, it's overstated. In reality, Africans that were forcefully brought to America, you know, they didn't have it so bad. They were slaves, but you know, what was the alternative? Live in a mud hut? If that's the message, then that teacher should be fired, because you shouldn't teach that to your kids.
He's doing it again, and it's infuriating. Metatron clearly understands how this language could be used, but is categorically refusing to see it in its proper context. He says it again. If an individual teacher frames slavery like this, then they should get fired. But my guy, it's not some random hypothetical teacher saying this. It's the teaching guide for the entire state of Florida. And the guide is a direct result from the laws pushed by conservatives in that state. And don't take it from me. Take it from Florida teacher Jorge Botello, who was interviewed in one of the articles that Metatron cited. Quote, "What does this mean for you as a middle school teacher? As a teacher, I will still teach. I teach civics, and in my class we learn about different amendments that were passed in these landmark court cases. Of course, one of them being the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. That's the short version. From this I have to explain slavery. And I, in good conscience, cannot say or think it's ethically correct to say, well, you know, African Americans did benefit from slavery. As a person who studied African American history, and I studied the African American experience in high school earlier in my career, I know they didn't benefit from slavery. So by suggesting that teachers saying slaves benefited from slavery should be fired, while ignoring the guide Metatron claimed to read, he's suggesting all teachers who follow the guide should be fired, and is never calling out the politicians responsible. So at this point, it would be pretty important to make that distinction. Are we gonna fight against individual teachers that played on slavery, or are we going to go after the system that is forcing a political agenda on children?
This is why I think that once again, a moderate take is the only based take in this discussion or scenario. Don't hide the facts. Don't say, no, that never happened and you're not allowed to say it. You're not allowed to say that he learned any skills. No, that's nonsense from the left.
I don't know how many times I can say this without losing my mind, but for the love of God, no one on the left is actually saying this. No one is arguing that slaves did not learn skills or that we shouldn't talk about it. It's about whether learning skills benefited the slaves, and if that's a framing we're okay with, which you already agreed is not okay. But can you please acknowledge it in its proper context and call out the people responsible? That's what you're supposed to do. That's what you say you do. So are you going to?
But it would be also nonsense, obviously, to try and use this as a justification to say, you see, slavery wasn't so bad. But is that what this board of educators is trying to do?
Oh my god. Is he getting back to it? Will he finally attack the negationism actively coming from the right? Are we finally getting this?
But is that what this board of educators is trying to do? That's where I reach the limits of this discussion. I don't know, because I'm not that deep within American politics.
My dude, you said that you read the entire 216-page document. You also read those articles. How deeper do you need to go before you reach the obvious conclusion?
So that's the part that I'm asking you. What do you think about this whole situation? What was the reason behind this bill? What were they trying to do with these specific ideas? And what are your opinions on the remarks coming from both sides, Harris and DeSantis?
Well, there we have it. Metatron, not political, will call out anyone regardless of their political leanings, but he couldn't address the worst example of historical negationism he ever covered without being an absolute coward. His defense throughout the video, and basically every single time the hypocrisy comes up, is the same. He did not make that obvious conclusion, which will lead him to criticize the right, because at the end of the day, he doesn't want to get political, so that's that.
This channel is not political. And as you know, on this channel we care about only one thing, the truth, which needs to be presented through the lenses of historical accuracy, logic, reason, and facts. Don't get me wrong, I hate when people present politically charged agendas, which is why I addressed that topic and today's topic from a completely apolitical standpoint. As I always say on this channel, people of all political persuasions are more than welcome in here, and all we do really is talk about the facts, and although I'm not going to address the politics of this. So how many of these controversial videos of mine are about politics? 100? 30? None. All of my content, which has been accused of being politically driven, was always connected to history. Without a historical tether, I don't talk about it.
And so, that's the reason he immediately refused to address this controversy in its full context, and that was the reason until now that he had never dared to address an example of real systemic attacks on history. In that sense, it's normal that he would not cross that line. But the thing is, Metatron has crossed that line, Many times. It's not been consistent at all, and it really just comes down to what side of the political aisle he happens to be talking about. And what this video did really is finally give me a concrete example of Metatron covering something coming from the right that I can compare side to side with a video attacking the left. And I use the term very broadly here, don't get me wrong, but it is a near identical situation, so that's exactly what we're going to do now. And for that, I'm bringing another video made by Metatron less than 2 months ago that I already covered previously. This Canadian university is out of its mind. In this video, Metatron is making fun of a Canadian university for having a section on race and terminology on their website, where they essentially propose different words for different things, which sometimes comes off a bit silly, like suggesting that instead of the word slave, the term enslaved is preferable. And this is how Metatron presents the topic.
I was reading what the directions are when it comes to having to write something for the university. So you go to this university and then what do you know? You got at one point you have to write something, whether it be a composition, whether it be an essay, and of course there were some guidelines, but they were mostly grammar, but not if you are in Canada. There are guidelines on what words are deemed offensive by the university that you're not allowed to use on whatever you're so basically you want a degree from there, you cannot use these words that are deemed offensive, and then the acceptable alternative.
As a quick side note, I just want to make it clear, although I do expand upon it in the previous video, but Metatron here is completely wrong. This document is not part of school policy, it does not control the language of students, as it does not apply to the school curriculum whatsoever. But for the sake of this video and showing the double standards, I'm going to proceed nonetheless with Metatron's premise and see how he approaches it. So on one side, we have a list of words on the website of a Canadian university. On the other, we have a teaching guide from Florida that uses controversial language to describe slavery. So the Canadian university, according to Metatron, is forcing students to use specific terminology as part of writing essays or dissertations. But what about the teaching guide from Florida? Is it forcing teachers to phrase slavery in a specific way? Well, we can't talk about politics because we never do on this channel, so let's just assume that it's vague, that both the left and the right are overreacting, and let's instead stick to history and ask if slaves actually learned skills, something nobody was denying or even talking about. And speaking of history, this is the angle from which Metatron approaches the Florida teaching guide, and the only reason he's talking about it at all apparently, because it involves the historical topic of slavery.
Although I'm not going to address the politics of this, I'd like to discuss the topic of slavery from the perspective of actual documented evidence and facts.
So what was the historical context that warranted the video on the Canadian university?
So, not too long ago, I was browsing the internet, as I usually do, and then I ran into the website, the official website of the University of Waterloo in Canada.
Oh, there wasn't any. He was just presumably browsing the web, saw this of all things, and made a video about it. I guess history isn't needed at all to make a video then, as he told me in the comments.
All of my content, which has been accused of being politically driven, was always connected to history. Without a historical tether, I don't talk about it.
So one topic is not historical, but he talks about it anyway, and the other is political, but he tries to ignore that to make it historical instead. Now, in the video with the Florida School Board, he stops himself from reaching a political conclusion because that's just not what he does on his channel. But what about the Canadian University video? If it's not about history, what's the message of the video? It can't possibly be political, right? Like talking about those things that have nothing to do with history, like freedom of speech or political propaganda?
You know why this drives me nuts? Is because university, academia, are supposed to be neutral. And they're supposed to be neutral because they're supposed to show you facts and be logical, right? This is political propaganda. And they are being forced to use language that this specific party considers appropriate. This is highly problematic. The moment language is censored and you are told what you're supposed to write, even if you don't think it, you keep writing it and you end up saying what they want you to say, you're pushing their message whether you like it or not, which to me is unconstitutional. What they're trying to do is that they're trying to dictate what you're allowed to say and therefore, possibly, in their mind, by extension, what you're allowed to think. This is very dangerous. It's a very dangerous route. I know we laughed about it and it is funny, but apart from being funny, it's also dangerous because whenever you look at totalitarian regimes, it happened with the fascists in Italy, it happened with the Nazi party in Germany, and of course it happened with Stalin and the communists in Russia in the 1940s, that the government will use anything in their power, in this case academia, to suppress individual thought.
It is genuinely amazing to see Metatron unambiguously call something political propaganda, call it censorship, and forcing people to use a specific language, and even making comparisons with the fascists and the Nazis, and then stopping short of doing the exact same thing the moment that political propaganda comes from the right. And keep in mind, the attempts by DeSantis to censor schools in the teaching of history is clear-cut. It's been thoroughly documented. This article from the University of Waterloo isn't even enforced in any capacity, so one is real, the other is fake. So if it's woke terminology on a Canadian university's website, Metatron doesn't even need it to be about history. He'll gladly talk about it anyway and call it political propaganda at the first chance he gets. But if it's right-wing politicians putting pressure on the school system to enforce specific language on slavery though, well, it's too political, so I can't get into that. But also, the left does a lot of attacks too, but if it's an attack from the right, well, I don't know, even though I read a whole bunch on it. So let me ask my audience what they think instead, so I don't come too harsh or biased. Again, this is not because Metatron's channel is not political. It is. And it doesn't matter how many times he says otherwise. The videos, the premises, what he claims to be fighting against, it's all by design political. I was using this video because they are so similar in context that the contrast in the way he speaks of the two topics is really obvious. But he's made a lot of those political videos before, talking about how British cartoons are misleading children because of a black Roman. That's political, by which I mean he's making it political.
And to those who say, but these are just cartoons, relax bro. If you are familiar with history, specifically World War II, the powerful propaganda used by Germany between 1939 and 1945 specifically made use of propaganda cartoons. So yeah, I'll take them seriously.
Talking about homosexuality in ancient Greece would be one thing, but doing so specifically from the perspective of debunking LGBT activists, that's political, and he's the one making it political.
This is the case, for instance, of this page, far from being the only one, which is clearly trying to use the framework of Greco-Roman civilization as a historical example of a gay social paradise. But it's far from being the professionally conducted comprehensive analysis that you would need to do that. This is biased, incompetent, shoddy work.
Accusing historical fiction of doing propaganda while citing PragerU pundits? That's political. Claiming that Netflix chose to make Cleopatra black instead of making a show on the Kandake because Cleopatra's cultural significance makes it easier to brainwash people through mass psychology? That's not only political, it's also conspiratorial.
Also, when it comes to mass psychology, the key to establish a false memory is its significance to the group. Hence, Cleopatra was the right pick, not the Kandake. In my opinion, if we allow the values of the present to manipulate the past, we risk to enter a circle of doom projected to our immediate future, as each successive present will then reshape the past according to their values, which, make no mistake, will change.
And even the few token videos where he tries to criticize things coming from the right so as to appear balanced, even as they are few in between and often don't really address the core issues, these are also political by virtue of debunking other people's ideologies. And in this very context, choosing not to address the politics of this issue is also a political action in of itself, because you are choosing not to criticize the right, even when they do something you are fervently against. And by actively trying to strip the topic away from its political implications, you're also downplaying its severity and helping disconnect the right from the actions that they endorse. So it's not because Metatron is not political that he stops short of reaching the obvious conclusion. It's because he's a right-wing grifter who knows attacking the right will not make his audience happy. So that's why he's asking them at the very end what they think of the controversy instead of finding out the truth himself, even though he did more research by reading the entire bill than any of his viewers possibly could. So where does that leave us? Well, at the end of me making videos on Metatron, hopefully, I'm not gonna pretend like I don't enjoy making these videos, because I do. I do enjoy calling people out when they make a whole career out of pretending to be something they're not. And Metatron is not a neutral academic, and he's not apolitical. And a lot of times he's not even correct on the things he's talking about. But 4 videos in, or 5 if I count one of my oldest essays that I don't stand by anymore, I don't think this is something I can substantiate further. At this point, I could only respond to new videos as they come out, but I'm not interested in doing that either. Ultimately, what I wanted to do was show to anyone willing to watch that Metatron is not who he says he is. He should not be trusted to present the topics he covers objectively, neutrally, or even correctly. At the end of the day, a lot of history channels are fun and informative, and while Metatron to his credit still does a lot of that, I also think a lot of his content is harmful. When you present diversity in historical movies as anything more than a mild inaccuracy, all you're really teaching your audience is to be skeptical of diversity. And here's the thing about that has always been true. Historical fiction is fictional. Movies will never get everything right, whether they genuinely try or don't. So it's one thing to say that a movie has the wrong helmet for the time period. We're just history nerds, all learning together. But it's a whole other thing to suggest that getting the skin color wrong is dangerous, or some nefarious agenda to change true history with political correctness. If an all-black movie set in Africa streamlines some of the history to make a summer blockbuster, Metatron will argue they nonetheless have a responsibility to be accurate.
And any form of infotainment that is based on real events and real characters, even though they can take some liberties when compared to a full-on documentary, they still have a responsibility because they have the power to inform or misinform.
But if Ridley Scott wants to kill an historical figure with a fictional character, all he had to say was that the movie isn't a documentary, and for Metatron, that would be totally fine.
All he needed to do was to say, look, this is not a documentary, I'm taking some artistic liberties, I've decided to show this instead of that because I think it looks good for the movie. I mean, at the end of the day, sort of a similar situation that happened in Gladiator. I understand why you want to have a final duel in the arena. I understand that more interesting from a plot standpoint than, for example, the actual way the Emperor of Rome died, which was strangled in the bath by his trainer. I absolutely understand that.
Metatron's issues are not historical accuracy or the dangers of misrepresenting history. If it was about historical accuracy, Metatron's rhetoric would not change from the inaccuracy of skin color to virtually anything else. And if it was about misrepresenting history, Metatron would not shy away from talking about where it is actually happening, while courageously exposing political propaganda on Netflix. The real issue for Metatron is skin color. If Metatron had his way, historical movies would always be, to an extent, segregated by skin color under the pretext of telling the historical truth. But then they would get a whole bunch of other things wrong, and those would not be seen as a big deal. And he might defend himself on the idea that he just wants black people to make historical movies in Africa, but as seen before, this is not genuine either. If they try, he'll trash the movies without even watching them. So I guess that just leaves us with one question. Is Metatron's rhetoric racist? And I would say yes it is. To be clear, it's not white supremacy racist, it's not Nazi racist, but it's racist nonetheless. Racism isn't a black and white issue, pun intended, it's a spectrum of different beliefs and ideas. You could genuinely want equality for all groups, but that would not stop you from holding beliefs that can end up excluding groups from certain things, like art. And in the end, if Metatron's history of double standards and hypocrisy isn't racism or signs of a right-wing bias, then I don't know what is. As a final side note, this is something that is often talked about on Metatron's channel but never really addressed. Metatron often categorizes videos attacking diversity and the woke as attacks on the far left. As a leftist, I would argue that representation is generally a good thing, but you'll never see anyone on the left defending the shallow tokenism of big media corporations. Attacking them and calling in attacks on the left isn't really accurate. What I would defend personally is the freedom of actors of color to play in all movies, whether it's historically accurate or not. After all, movies, shows, and history are all about culture, and culture should be accessible to everybody. Telling a black actor, for example, that they can't play a historical figure because the historical figure in question wasn't black, just makes me wonder to what extent should an actor look exactly like the historical figure that they portray? What if they don't have the same age, or the same height, or the same eye color? If you only draw the line at skin color, then that's literally all that you're doing. And really, that's what I fight against, because I think it sucks. As a final message to Metatron, I mean, he presumably watched all my other videos, so there's a genuine chance he might listen to this as well, but props for listening to criticisms, man. I don't think this video of yours did you any favors, it certainly did not change my mind, but the fact that you listened to hours of content of someone just attacking your videos, your arguments, and even your character, that takes a lot of guts, I can't deny it. What you do from here is up to you, but if you choose never to address me in your own videos, or if you choose not to do anything about the obvious biases that you have, then I'll just hope more of your audience finds themselves here, if only to see the other side of the coin. Either way, I hope to truly be done this time, because I'll be moving on to other projects. So for everyone else, well, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.